In this video, we will look at the creatorship of God. God, the Creator. We affirm this in the first article of our faith. We believe in God, the Father, the Almighty, the Creator of heaven and earth. So, the world, physical reality, did not just come into exist by its own. We recognize there is this Creator, Almighty God, who is behind this. And also that it hasn't always existed. There was a point in time where it came into being. Now, of course, the Old Testament understanding of creation developed over time, and there are various texts that speak about creation in the Old Testament. You can encounter them in Psalms 104, Job 38, verses 8 to 11, and also Isaiah 40, verses 44, but also principally Genesis 1 and 2, where God creates the world. Now, of course, God here creates the world in 7 days, and a few words of caution are necessary here. Because when we read the Genesis narrative, we must not take it literally, that God really created the world in 6 days and then rested on the 7th. This narrative is not interested in exactly how things happened. It does not explain science. It does not explain Big Bang Theory or anything like that. What it does want to explain is it wants to convey the meaning it wants to give to creation, especially from the worldview of the Israelites at the time. Because the creation story in Genesis explains that God created order from chaos. If you read there Genesis 1, it speaks there of the void, and it was without form. In other words, it was a chaotic state. And then God comes and He creates order from this chaos. So strictly speaking, Genesis was not creation from nothing. It was creation from a pre-existing chaos. This idea of creation from nothing was a doctrine that only developed later on in Jewish thought. But first, let's go look at this creation story of Genesis 1. God creates in 7 days or in 6 days. On the 7th day He rested. But part of the story is He created order out of chaos. And we can see how this order works if we look at the days of creation. If you look at day 1, there God created day and night. And then in day 2, God created the firmament or the heavens, and there was a division of waters. Day 3, there was a separation of the sea and land, and also the plants that emerged. Now, days 1, 2, and 3 we can describe as the elements. Because the next days, there it describes the uses of the elements. In day 4, we can see that there God creates the sun, the moon, and the stars. And that creates the light that was created on day 1. So day 1 and day 4 stand in relationship to each other. There's an order to creation. Also day 5 stands in relationship to day 2. Because the uses of the elements on day 5 is the water creatures, fish, etc., and the birds. It uses the elements created on day 2, the firmament or the heaven, and also the division of the waters. Similar thing with day 6. There's the uses of the elements. It's the land animals and human beings. They make use of the sea, also the land, and also the plants. So the author tells in this, it's a beautifully crafted narrative, this creation account in Genesis 1, that God has created the world according to a specific order. Also present there is that the sun, moon, and stars were created things. Some people in the surrounding area of the ancient Israelites believed that the sun, moon, stars, they were gods to be worshipped. And yeah, this narrative also distinguishes the Israelite people from all the rest in saying, no, our God, He's almighty. We worship the true God. He created the sun and the moon. So, God created order out of chaos. The whole world has this perfect order. God created the world to come to be in a state of ritual purity, where all disorder was discarded and gotten rid of. So this is the creation narrative in Genesis. Of course, it also culminates in the creation of human beings, or the creation of man. And it says specifically that mankind, that's both man and woman, was created in the image of God. This image means that human beings are representations of God. This word, the Hebrew, can also mean statue or likeness or representation. Human beings, being the image of God, are representations of God on earth. And part of that image is also that they have been given dominion over God's creation. And of course, they were also instructed, be fruitful and multiply. But the image of God means also that human beings have a specific function. They are to have dominion and rule over creation. And part of this image is also that creation must give mankind homage. So mankind is in a special and privileged position in creation. Some theologians also connect this idea, the image of God, also with immortality. That human beings kind of share in this immortality. Not inherently, because we stand in a relationship to God. It's a relationship with God, in that sense, that gives us this immortality. Now, of course, the idea of continuous creation also is suggested in the Old Testament. And there we come across it in Psalms 104. If you read verses 10 and 27, He sends the springs into the valleys, they flow among the hills. These all wait for you, that you may give them their food in due season. So in other words, creation is not just an event that took place right at the beginning, at some time in the past. Creation is also something that continues today. Also today God creates, because He gives food. There's development. And that's also the normal understanding of the doctrine of creation by most Christian churches today. Creation is not something that just happened in the past. Reference is made to this notion of continuous creation. God even creates today, here and now. So God, also as the creator of history, of the world and the world's history, is also made reference to in Isaiah. Isaiah 44, verses 24 to 26. I am the Lord who makes all things, who stretches out the heavens all alone, who spreads abroad the earth by myself, who confirms the word of His servant and performs the counsel of His messengers, who says to Jerusalem, you shall be inhabited, to the cities of Judah, you shall be built, and I will raise up her waste places. So God is not only a creative God in that sense, God is also a creator and Lord of history. God guides history. God's the Lord of history. God allows history to take place. So this is the understanding of God's creatorship in the Old Testament. Now the New Testament, it also makes reference that Jesus the Son is also involved in the creation. If you go read the prologue to John's Gospel, in John 1 verses 1 to 3, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through Him. That's the Word, Jesus. And without Him, nothing was made that was made. So the New Testament affirms that the Son was also involved in creation. And there are also further references in this regard. You also can read about this in Colossians 1 verses 12 to 20, Ephesians 1 verses 3 to 14, and also Hebrews 1 verses 2. It also affirms Jesus the Son was involved in the creation. But the creation is in need of redemption. In other words, the creation is not final. It's not complete. It's not perfect. It's not eternal. If we can read about this, what Paul writes to the Romans, in Romans 8 verses 19 to 22, Paul writes, "For the earnest expectation of the creation eagerly awaits for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope. Because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs together until now." So in other words, it also says here that creation doesn't exist in of itself. It doesn't have its own power. It does not sustain itself in its own being. It's subject to corruption. In other words, to death and decay, to change. But God's going to change all this, Apostle Paul says. Of course, we believe also in the new creation. God's going to renew this creation that we see. So this creation is temporary. And Paul also writes about this temporary nature of creation, what we experience here and now. And Paul writes about this specifically in 1 Corinthians 7, verses 29 to 31. Paul says, "But this I say, brethren, the time is short, so that from now on even those who have wives should be as though they had none. Those who weep as though they did not weep. Those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice. Those who buy as though they did not possess. And those who use this world as not misusing it. For the form of this world is passing away." So Paul gives us here what is called in our notes an eschatological proviso. In other words, you can have a relationship with this world, but don't become too attached to it. Things of this world, they are temporary. So it's not designed to endure, because something bigger and better is coming. Do not become too attached to this time frame here and now, because this world is transitory. It's not eternal. So if you look at this world, it has been created by God. And so on the one hand, we affirm it was God's creation, but also that it won't last eternally. So we are not like the Gnostics. Remember the Gnostics that was introduced in earlier videos? For them, they said this world was created by an evil God, some lesser demiurge, some lesser being. And matter is evil, and we must escape matter. That was the teaching of the Gnostics. And they said Jesus came from the true God to bring knowledge, or gnosis. There we are different from the Gnostics as Christians. If we look on screen, there it's divided into three areas: Gnosticism, Christian theism, and pantheism. And if we look at Gnosticism, for them there's enmity between the true God and the world. Remember their teaching of the true God. The true God did not create the world or physical matter. We don't agree with the Gnostics. That's extreme. That is false. Because God did create the world. Then on the other extreme, there's pantheism. The ancient Stoics, or the philosophy of Stoicism, they were pantheists. And pan means all. And pantheism says all is God. Everything is God. The world, everything in the natural world is God. But we disagree. We say, no, God, the true God, is the creator. He created this physical world. But also that the world's not perfect and eternal and all that, like pantheists hold, the world is in need of redemption. It is temporary. Something bigger and better is yet to come because God's going to renew the world. So Christian theism finds itself in between Gnosticism on one extreme and pantheism on the other extreme. Now we also look at the early church's profession of God as creator, the creatorship of God. So of course this is based on biblical testimony from both the Old and the New Testament. Already at the Apostolicum, also known as the Apostles' Creed, it was affirmed, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. Now of course, remember the creeds that we discussed earlier, that was to counter Arianism and its idea that Jesus wasn't God. Also, it was formulated to counter the Gnostics, their teaching that the true God did not create the world. So the Creed of Niceno-Constantinople, it rejects those false teachings and it affirmed, we believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and of all things visible and invisible. So there's not some demiurge or lesser deity that created the world and it was some bad mistake that happened that we must escape from. We are here for a purpose because God created us and the world. We were intended to be here. And of course also in our New Apostolic Church, our first article of faith, we affirm this when we say, I believe in God, the Father, the Almighty, the creator of heaven and earth. So for us, creation is not a mistake. It's not evil. This is part of God's divine purpose. So it's good. And we honor and praise God for being the creator and putting us here. Now, how the doctrine of the church also developed, also in the medieval period, this doctrine of creation. Of course, it interacted also with other ideas, especially philosophical movements. For example, like Platonism. Remember the philosopher Plato? We met him in the first video. He believed in this world of forms or ideas, in other words, eternal patterns. And according to him, there was this being called the demiurge who copied this world of forms to create the physical world. Of course, his idea was radicalized and made extreme by the Gnostics, which I spoke about earlier. But he also had this idea of creation. There's this world of pre-existing forms. There's also this demiurge or being who creates the physical world by copying the world of forms. There's also Neoplatonism. And very important here is a philosopher by the name of Plotinus. For him, the world emanated from God, who Plotinus called the One. And these emanations happened spontaneously. The One had no control over it. The One emanated. There were various levels of emanation, and one of those emanations was the physical world that came to be. And it happened spontaneously, inherently. It happened that way. Also, Aristotle and Aristotelianism. Aristotle also spoke about God, but Aristotle called this God the unmoved mover. Because he also saw things moved. Where does this movement come from? Remember also the medieval philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas. He develops the thought of Aristotle in new and exciting ways. But already back at the time of Aristotle, he called God the unmoved mover. He's the cause of all other movement and change. But this God of Aristotle, even though he created the world, he's not even aware that he created the world because he's too busy contemplating his own perfection. So this is a God who is the creator, but he's not even aware that he's a creator or that he created the world. So Christian theology, of course, interacted with these various philosophical, intellectual currents through the centuries, and it affirms God, the triune God, is the creator, fully aware of it and his divine purpose behind this creation. Now we will look at some fundamental statements of Christian creation doctrine. So there's a particular way that we must understand how God creates. Remember when I said about Plotinus, he referred to God as the One, and there were various emanations that just spontaneously came from the One, and eventually the world was also created. But their Christian doctrine is different, because it holds that creation is a work of the freedom of God. In other words, the world is contingent. God created it. The world did not create itself. Because from nothing, nothing comes. That's a famous philosophical dictum used by many. God created the world because He chose to create the world. It was not because of necessity. God has freedom. So in other words, this means is that God did not have to create the world. He could exist without the world. So the world has come into being on the basis of the free and completely unfettered divine will. Because God's not restricted by anything. There's no limitations on God. God doesn't make choices, right? Because God is absolute being. God freely acts. Because if God makes choices also, there's a greater reality than God. But so God in the creation is not a necessity. Why does creatorship exist? Because it's the result of God's freedom, God's innate freedom, the freedom of His being to create. So we can look at the question, why is there creation? Why does the world exist this way? And the answer is because God wanted it that way. It's a result of God's freedom. Now the second fundamental statement of Christian creation doctrine is the relationship between God and the world. So if you look at the world of emanation, in other words, Plotinus, how the world emanated from God, and also at the Stoics, who were pantheists, they said everything is God. There's a blurring between God and the world. For pantheism, God and the world is one and the same thing. But for Christian doctrine, it's very clear. There is a very sharp distinction between God the Creator and what is created. Reality is a free action of God, and it's distinctive. It's absolutely distinct. Remember also Arianism, where Jesus was relegated or demoted to being part of creation. Early church rejected that idea and said, no, Jesus is part of the triune God. Jesus creates. But there's a clear distinction between God, the triune God, the Creator, and the created world. There's no blurriness about it. Of course, Jesus becoming human being, now that's another dimension altogether, the doctrine of hypostatic union. But that has nothing to do with the doctrine of creation. So there's this fundamental statement is, what's the relationship between God and the world? There is a relationship, yes, because God is the Creator, but there's no identification between the two. They don't share the same essence or substance. The world is not divine. The world is not God. There's a clear distinction between Creator and created. And the third aspect we will look at, the next fundamental statement is creatio ex nihilo. That's Latin for creation from nothing. Like I said before, the creation narrative in Genesis, strictly speaking, is not creation from nothing. There God creates order from pre-existing chaos. Later texts suggest creation from nothing. For example, if you look at the Apocrypha, 2 Maccabees 7 verse 28, it reads, I beseech thee, my son, look upon the heaven and the earth, and all that is therein, and consider that God made them of things that were not, and was so mankind made likewise. Like this also, you can read Wisdom of Solomon 11 verse 17. It says, "For thine almighty hand that made the world of matter without form," etc. Also, Hebrews 11 verses 3, it says there, "By faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible." So this moves in the direction of creation from nothing, or in Latin, creatio ex nihilo. So that's another fundamental statement of Christian doctrine. At a stage, there was no physical reality. Then God created it from nothing. So scientists speculate that the universe is about 13.8 billion years old. And this affirms that this creation from nothing. There was nothing and God created. And the biblical language is through His spoken word. Now the last aspect we will look at is God's accompaniment of the creation. So in other words, God accompanies creation. We are not deists. Remember deism? Deists believe that there is a God who created the world but then stopped being involved in creation and does nothing anymore. So we are not deists, we are monotheists. And part of monotheism says God is the creator but is still involved in creation. God accompanies creation. He still governs creation. Things just don't happen by themselves. It only happens because God governs it. And again, let me re-emphasize this idea that God also creates here and now. Even at this very moment, as you are watching this video, you exist because God gives you being. God now gives you existence. You don't make yourself exist. You might think, I choose now to continue living and existing. But it's not you. It's God who now gives you existence right now. So God is still involved in creation. God accompanies creation. God creates history. Things also happen according to His will, so that His plans can be fulfilled. Because remember, we're involved in salvation history. History is not just things that happen and has no meaning. We live in salvation history. God has a purpose with creation. God has a purpose with events that happen in history. That's why He also accompanies His creation. He governs His creation. And He also sustains His creation in this moment right now, so it can have being and existence. So these are the four fundamental statements of Christian creation doctrine. Creation is a work of the freedom of God. In other words, it's a result of contingency. It is contingent creation because God has created it. And God didn't create it out of compulsion or because He didn't have no choice. It comes from this innate freedom of God to create. And creation didn't have to exist. Secondly, this relationship between God and the world, there's a clear distinction between the creator and the created. Then creation from nothing, or creatio ex nihilo, we believe that God created the world from nothing. In other words, there wasn't pre-existing matter that God took and gave form to it. There was nothing, then God created matter. Then also God's accompaniment of the creation. God accompanies creation. He sustains it in existence. His providence guides history, salvation history, for His plans and purposes to come to fruition. So that's our video on the creatorship of God. In our next video, we will look at the problem of theodicy.